On each of us, thy learning shed, we sang. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, but most of all, Lady Hale, welcome to this celebration of Gilbert and Sullivan and the law, which tonight we're using as the soundtrack to your life. This concert was to have marked the Society's 40th anniversary, but as with so many events everywhere, it has been thwarted by COVID. So we're celebrating a little late, but we're celebrating both the Savoy Operas and the law. We're really delighted to have you in Jersey with us to talk about your legal career and your recent autobiography, and indeed to shed some of your learning. We chose to introduce you with a piece from one of the lesser-known operas of Gilbert and Sullivan, Utopia Limited, the piece O Maiden Rich in Girton Law, because I believe that's where you first studied law as an undergraduate. And I also understand it's when you were yourself performing the words and music of Gilbert and Sullivan.
That's absolutely true, Lucy. When I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, I joined the Gilbert and Sullivan Society. It seemed somehow rather less posh than the Amateur Dramatic Society, which took itself awfully seriously, whereas we in the Gilbert and Sullivan Society just had a ball. And we did an operetta a year. We did, I think, the Gondoliers in my first year, Iolanthe in my second year, and in my third year, we did the Yeoman of the Guard, and I wasn't just in the chorus, I actually had a small part.
Yes, in that quartet.
Kate, yes. I'm afraid I sang rather sharp, so they had to have an accompaniment for something that's supposed to be sung a cappella. So downhill from ever after.
Right. Yes, I noticed from reading your book you are actually quite a thespian. There's various bits there.
Well, of course, I'm a member of Gray's Inn, which is where I qualified as a barrister. And every year in Gray's Inn we have a show just before Christmas, which we call the Miscellany, but it actually does tend to have a story. And the whole purpose of the Miscellany is that all the young students and young barristers show off their brilliant acting, singing and dancing skills, and the oldies like me make fools of ourselves. So we have a lovely time. I have been all things from a can of soup, pretending to be an Andy Warhol portrait, from a barmaid, again, pretending to be mayonnaise barmaid. This is an art-themed show, if you understand. And another one when we had films, I was Mae West. I was very good Mae West because I just walked like this and had all the best lines. Some of them were extremely good. So yes, I've done all sorts of stuff like that.
And I think we'll see from the next picture, your G&S stayed with you was that from the Miscellany, this next picture we have, which I believe is May?
Oh yes, that was when we had a round the world in 80 days thing, but at some stage our hero landed in Japan, where he encountered the three little maids.
From Mikado, yes.
From the Mikado, yes, and I was young. But I think we were, one junior, one silk, and one judge, one silk, and one something else. But we were a diversity statistic because we were rare birds like women, you see, in these senior roles. It was good fun.
Thank you. Lady Hale, you were born Brenda Marjorie Hale in Yorkshire, and we're going to talk about your time in Richmond, but I understand you actually spent your very early years in Redcar, which interests us because several members of the society are actually from Teesside. And I wanted to mention our lunchtime today when we met somebody who had a family connection with you, Hugh Lindsey, who some of the audience may know as a musician and a choir conductor here in Jersey. And he did at one stage actually conduct this Gilbert and Sullivan Society. So perhaps you could just tell us, it's such an interesting story about the Doll's House.
Well, she's stolen the line.
I beg your pardon.
There we go. Hugh Lindsey's father, Martin Lindsey, was a teacher at the same school, Sir William Turner's school in Cotham, in Redcar, as my father was for many years. And during the war, when there was a blackout, there wasn't a lot of socialising going on. And so my father decided that he would build a doll's house for my elder sister. I was not on the scene in those days, long before I was even thought of. And my father built this amazing Tudor cottage doll's house. It was absolutely lovely. But it had working electric light and working plumbing. And that was the work of Hugh's father.
Yes, it was so nice that Hugh brought pictures.
He brought pictures of it
yes.
for lunchtime. It was gorgeous to see.
Wonderful.
I mean, the doll's house is still in existence, but it is not in its former glory, I have to say.
Thank you. So, when you were very young, you moved to the village of Scorton, which is close to that lovely Yorkshire market town of Richmond. And I believe you went to Richmond High School for Girls before you read law at Cambridge, and you graduated with a starred first, being one of only 6 women in a class of 110 men. Was that right?
Something like that. It was that sort of thing, yes. Yes.
Very modest of you.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you how you thought your early life and upbringing had shaped your career and attitudes.
Well, lots of ways, of course. I mean, it does for all of us, doesn't it? But my parents were both teachers. My father left Sir William Turner School to become headmaster of a small independent boys' boarding school in Scorton. And there was a huge atmosphere in favour of education and learning. It's taken for granted that the 3 daughters would all go to university if they could, which, when you come to think about it, was an amazing ambition to have, because in those days,
yes,
about 5% of the boys in the relevant age group went to university, and only about 2.5% of the girls. So it was quite an ambition to have, and we all managed to fulfil it, so that's down to our parents.
That's great to hear. When did you decide on a career in law?
Oh, well, I'm not sure my story about this is any more accurate than quite a lot of my stories, but I'm fond of saying that I chose to study law because my headmistress thought I was clever enough to go to Oxford or Cambridge, but not quite clever enough to read history, which was her subject. And of course, in those days, the people who weren't quite clever enough to read history read law. Now it's the other way around, of course, but that was then. But anyway, she said, well, what else could you do? And she was quite keen on economics, and I wasn't terribly keen on economics because I didn't like the economic theory that we'd had to do in our A-level history course. But I had loved the constitutional history of the 17th century. Really dramatic century in British history, you know, where we had a rebellion and killed our king, then we restored the monarchy, but that didn't work out, and so we had a revolution when we got rid of the king and brought in a king and queen who agreed to be constitutional monarchs, in other words, on terms, with limited powers. And that's the foundation of our modern constitution. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating, particularly the way that people of principle were prepared to fight for what they thought was right, even at great personal risk, the sort of personal risk we don't suffer these days. We might get onto that later on. But that's what fascinated me about the law. And so I said, well, what about law? And the headmistress, despite being a rather traditional soul, didn't say, nonsense, girls don't do law. Or if they do, they only do it if their father's a solicitor. She said, that's a very good idea. And it turned out we were both right.
What decided you upon the academic side of the legal profession rather than practice at the bar?
Well, I started out doing both.
Oh, yeah.
Because when I graduated from Cambridge with an unexpectedly, as far as I was concerned, good degree, I actually found out about my first year's exam results, where I got a first, much to my surprise, when I was singing with the Gilbert and Sullivan Society chorus in an opera composed by Donald Swan. In fact, backstage we were just talking about Flanders and Swan and the drop of a hat and all their wonderful things. Not probably very well known that Donald Swan did write this opera called Perilandra, and it was there were 3 concert performances in Oxford, Cambridge and London, and they recruited the Gilbert and Sullivan Society chorus to be the chorus. So that's another connection with Gilbert and Sullivan. Anyway, so I found out. So, okay, right, so I was getting good results, and I decided that I would go and become a law teacher at the University of Manchester. But I picked the University of Manchester because they wanted me to qualify as a barrister and practice at the same time as doing my teaching. So I spent a few happy years doing both, and I really liked them both. But you can't do them both forever. You know, the cases get in the way of, well, the students get in the way of doing the long cases, put it that way, rather than the other way round. But of course the cases get in the way of doing the research and writing which any successful academic needs to do. So I decided that I would concentrate on the academic side, and that was largely because I was married to a chap who was also starting out at the Manchester Bar at the same time. And we thought it would be quite a good idea if one of us had a steady job with a salary. University teachers aren't paid much, but they are paid. Whereas when you start out at the bar, at least when you did then, at the common law bar, you do not know where the next brief is coming from, and you certainly don't know where the fee from the next brief is coming from and when you're going to get it. So it seemed like a good idea. And the other thing was that we wanted a family. It's a great deal easier to combine having a family with academic life than it is with practice at the knockabout common law bar. I expect it's true also in Jersey, but it certainly was true in Manchester. You could be in chambers at 6 o'clock at night and a brief would come in and you'd be in Carlisle at 9 o'clock the following morning. This is not very family friendly.
Sure. Thank you for that. I'd like to move on. I'd like particularly to mention your interest in women's equality. I believe they've called it the Brenda agenda. Did you really have an agenda?
Well, I didn't think it was an agenda, but I have never made any secret of the fact that I believe in equality for women. And that means that I think women's experience, which is different from men's, is just as important in the law as is the experience of men. After all, we are half the human race. And so the law shouldn't only be shaped by the experiences of men. So I've never made any secret of that. And if that's an agenda, well, I'm proud of it.
Thank you for that. What were your particular concerns about the position of women in society, or perhaps particularly in the profession?
Well, when you think about it, I said, you know, half the girls going to university as boys when I went to university. When I went to Cambridge, there were all the colleges were single sex, and there were 3 colleges for women and 21 colleges for men. So that was a sex ratio of approximately 9 men to every 1 woman. Now there are advantages in that for the women. It has to be confessed, but of course deeply unfair. And of course now it's roughly 50-50 in Cambridge, and a very good thing too. And it's 50-50 in my old college, Girton, which is also a very good thing too. It's transformed the place. Lots more exciting than it was when I was there. But there we go. But those were things. And then there were an awful lot of really things that sound like nothing very much, but actually were very important. So, for example, there were bars that you couldn't go into if you were a woman. There were women who were paid. One of my students at Manchester decided she didn't want to become a solicitor, so she applied for a job with an insurance company and was told that she would be paid 2/3 what a man would be paid for doing exactly the same job. We had a professor, very distinguished lawyer who joined us as a professor in the late 1960s, and she couldn't get a mortgage to buy a house in Manchester without having a male guarantor. She wasn't married. The best she could do was her father, who was a retired civil service, or I think local government official, in his 80s. His credit was thought better than hers as a professor, a tenured professor in the University of Manchester. So there was all that sort of stuff. But that was basically outlawed by the Sex Disqualification. No, not the Sex Disqualification, the Sex Discrimination Act. But that took quite a long time for people to understand what it really meant.
Yes.
I mean, for things to sink in. So the price of equality actually is eternal vigilance.
Yes, yes. So things have moved a bit, but do you think there's still more that could be done?
Oh, I'm sure there's more that could be done. In many ways, I think the law is certainly in the UK, equality law is pretty good. But the administration of the law is not necessarily so good. And I don't know what it's like in Jersey, but we certainly have a big problem with the enforcement of sexual offences. You know, both the detection of them, the policing of them, taking them seriously, charging, prosecuting, and trials in particular. We've had recent scandals which of course have brought that very much to the public attention. There's a lot of work to be done there still.
Yes, at least it's very much on the agenda, and maybe that will
Well,
help.
it's a very good thing that it's on the agenda. But
how do you think we can change attitudes to women in the workplace?
that's a rather big question, isn't it? And I'm not sure it's for me to answer it, because you know, one of the things about judges is they're really, really good at telling other people what to do. But actually, they're not necessarily as good at doing it themselves. So although I have managed a court with a rather difficult set of people, you might think, I have never really had to manage a workplace. So I think I'm not the right person to answer that.
You did, however, co-write a book that was entitled Women in the Law. Can you tell us what that was about?
Yes, this was in 1984 it was published, and it was the very first book of its kind. There are now quite a lot of books on it. But what we tried to do, you know, the law is divided into several subjects like contract and crime and